For those of you who are new with us, my name's Abby, and I would love to connect with you after the service. I'll be back in our guest service area. It's over in our One Cup Cafe, and we have a gift for you guys for being here. You guys can check out for a moment. We're going to talk to people who call Rethink Church our home for a minute as we go into our tithes and offering. Next week, we are going to be giving, it's our Mission Sunday, the last Sunday of every month. We like to give to a ministry called Destiny Rescue, which is helping rescue women and children out of sex trafficking overseas. And so far, we've been able to raise funds this year to rescue at least 2 girls out of sex trafficking, and not just rescue them, but help with their restoration after the fact, which is really amazing. So we're excited to continue that next week. And then also, I want to share a verse with you guys this morning. It's James 1:5, which tells us, if any of you lack wisdom, let us ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. And that verse doesn't really have to do with money or giving or tithing or anything like that, but I think it shows us, like, not only do we get to give to God and to our community, but God also wants to give things to us. And so we can ask God for that wisdom to get us through whatever we're going through in our lives, or, He uses us to minister to others, and so if He gives us that wisdom, then we can minister better, or we can even pray for that wisdom for other people and for our community, which I think we all need right now in this season. So I want to challenge you guys, not just to give, but to also ask God for wisdom this week. And if you do want to partner with us financially here at Rethink Church, you can either give online at rethinkchurch.cc, or you can give in person. We have a black box by the door. We hope you guys enjoyed Mark's sermon this morning.
So my name is Mark, by the way. We don't have a nice little bumper video because we're like, whatever. We don't need that. So every once in a while, we're just going to change it up on you, and that's going to be okay. So we're going to be in Ephesians chapter 5, and that's where we're going to be for just like a moment, because there's this moment where this word that Paul's writing to us, and it's kind of a loaded word. So we're going to we took last week to unpack a little bit of it, and then this week we're going to be unpacking, not the rest of it, but like, here's the deal. We're going to get covered Ecclesiastes and Job in just a short amount of time. And if you know those books, it's not something you do. Like, it's going to feel like drinking from a fire hose. Which, by the way, does anyone know the actual movie reference to that? UHF, Weird Al, awesome. You should just look it up. All right? So, this little kid named Billy, he's on like one of those game shows, and he finds a marble in mud or something, and he's like, you get to drink from the fire hose. It's one of my favorite lines all the time in the movie. So, but I won't show it to you because it's a little cheesy. So, there's that one. So, but Ephesians chapter 5, Paul is wrapping up this section from chapter 4, where he's talking about, this is how I want the followers of Jesus to walk, to live this out, right? So Paul's talked about identity, he's talked about calling, this is how we should, why we should live like this way, and now he's saying, okay, here's what it's going to look like for you to actually walk like this, right? So we're going to walk worthy of the calling that we have. We're going to walk distinctively. We're going to walk in love. We're going to walk as children of light. And now we're going to walk wisely. What does that actually mean? One of the things I like to actually do is kind of wrap myself into the picture, the story of it all, and see what it would feel like to be one of the original audience members who received these letters. Remember, these letters are written to other people, but they're written for us as well. So we're just picking that up, and it's like imagine somebody reading your letters. And now you're like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to shape my whole life based on this one letter too. You know what I mean? Like, that's what it kind of feels like every once in a while in the Bible. And so here's these two guys, Tychicus and Onesimus, are carrying these letters with them from Rome. Paul wrote them in Rome. He sends Tychicus and Onesimus. Onesimus is a runaway slave. And if you know the story of Philemon, this is that Onesimus. And he's sending him with 3 letters. The letter of Philemon, the letter to Colossae church, and then Ephesians church. And imagine they get to Ephesus, and there's probably 10 to 18 house churches. We're talking 200, 250 followers of Jesus in the city of Ephesus, which is the 3rd largest city in the Roman world. So here they are, and they're talking, and they're reading through, in Greek, they're reading these letters to each other. And Tychicus and Onesimus would have been with Paul writing this letter, understanding that when he says this word, this is what it means. When he's saying these kind of things, this is like, it's like giving an interpretation, or what other people would call preaching. which is what Onesimus and Tychicus are going to eventually end up doing. But imagine you're sitting there and they read the word walk wisely, and you can just ask yourself, what does Paul mean by that? And Tychicus and Onesimus could say, well, this is what he means. And one of the word images we've been using about what does it mean to walk wisely is walking into a bar and you see three stools. This is how every church service feels like it's going to go, right? Like, yeah, this is totally the way that it goes. But we see three stools at this bar. You have a question and you want to ask somebody. And so you see the first stool is filled by this lady. She's a young, up-and-coming, optimistic, like wise beyond her years type of a person, and she could just simply like rattle off those short little answers, right? Last week we handed out fortune cookies, right? Short little to the point answers. She's optimistic that if you follow this pattern, then good things will happen to you. And then the middle stool is this guy who is a middle-aged cynical man who's seen the pattern of Proverbs happen, right? The young and up-and-coming teacher, but he's also seen things where it just doesn't go that way. And he questions everything, right? He's like, yeah, that's true sometimes. But what happens when it doesn't look like that? Right? And then there's this quiet old man who just sits there. And when he speaks, you should probably listen, but he doesn't say a whole lot, does he? And you can tell by the way he carries himself, he's been through a lot in life. He's seen the heights of the highs, and he's seen the lowest of the lows. And when he speaks, everyone just kind of quiets down and listens to him. And then there's this lady probably off to the side who's like, you want to know what it's like to have wisdom in a relationship, like a marriage? You should probably come and read this book too. And this is what it looks like to approach the Hebrew literature book, wisdom literature books in Hebrew scriptures. Because Proverbs is that up-and-coming professor, teacher lady. Ecclesiastes is that cynical middle-aged man. Job, who we're going to talk about later today, is this elderly gentleman who's been through it all, right? And then some rabbis threw in the Songs of Solomon as wisdom literature. Probably because they're like, we have to have some kind of category. It's like risque literature here, so let's just throw wisdom in there, right? But all the married people are like, yeah, if you want to actually have a healthy marriage, it's going to take wisdom beyond your years, right? And this is what it looks like. So when Paul is talking about this, he's approaching this in that regard. So we talked about Proverbs last week. We're going to cover Ecclesiastes and Job. If you just want to take notes or just whatever, that's fine with me, because it's going to feel like you're going to drink from a fire hose, and that's awesome. All right? So here's how Ecclesiastes starts. Ecclesiastes, by the way, we're just going to barely touch the surface. Ecclesiastes starts with two voices. One is a teacher, and one is the author, and they're not the same. In English teachers, you know this. It's easy to get lost in the narrative. Like, who's actually speaking here? Is this the teacher? Is this the author? All this kind of stuff. And you just have to pay attention when you're reading this and all of that. The teacher challenges everything in normal life. If you find status in your money, and the teacher's going to be like, great, it's going to go away eventually, right? You think having a great weekend is the purpose of life? Awesome. Eventually that's going to get old. Your health is a status. Like, he's the guy you do not want to hang around with all the time. Proverbs is the friend you want to have, like you want to spend all the time you can with. And then Ecclesiastes is that old friend you have that you don't want to see a lot, but every once in a while you probably should see him, right? At the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, the author tells us this, that the words of the teacher are like a sharp goad at the end of a shepherd's rod. They're necessary, but you don't enjoy it. And the shepherd's rod is this tool that the shepherd would use, and he would sharpen the point of the shepherd's rod so that if the sheep were going off the path, they would just jab as hard as they could. Not to hurt him, but to keep him from going off the path. Because if they went off the path, the entire flock would go off the path. So the shepherd's rod, the goad, is this sharpened tool to bring pain, to bring correction. And this is what the author is saying. The teacher, his words are like that in Ecclesiastes. And it's one of those painful moments of like, oh yeah, there's this reality that happens, right? We go off of that, this path. And so there's, like, Ecclesiastes is just going to, like, challenge a lot of things in our lives. When you read the very first beginning of it, you see this, like, this trend or this theme of, like, everything is meaningless. We're going to get into that, what that actually means. But he says this, like generations just keep going on. Like the time, like no one can stop the time going on, right? Generation after generation, and then things just never seem to really have any meaning. He says this, the streams flow into the sea, but does the sea ever full? And can your eye ever see enough? Right? Like this is the reality. Like this is just like, you can take all these things in, but is there any point where you're like, I'm satisfied, I'm good? And he wrestles with some major things. Then the teacher, this is the beautiful thing about the teacher never claims to have the answers. But the teacher never avoids the hard questions. He wrestles with things that you just like, ooh, should you say that in the Bible? Like, I feel like if you're going to write the Bible, like you should have some of these settled down, right? But he doesn't. Here, like, for example, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 18, he says this. I said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are just like animals. Surely the fate of the human beings is just like the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so does the other. They both have breath, but humans have no advantage over the animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place. All came from dust, and all will return to dust. And who knows if the human spirit will rise up to upward, and if the spirit of the animal will go downward. He has no clue what happens with life after death. Which, by the way, if you're writing the Bible, you should probably have some idea, right? But the teacher's like, who knows? We read this as informed readers. We know what Jesus says. We know what Paul says. We know what other scripture writers say. But the author and the teacher, they don't. And the beautiful thing about this is, the author puts this in here. He doesn't say, if you don't have these answers, you can't, wrestle through these things. You just believe and apply it, right? He's like, no, you should wrestle through these things too. Yeah. If you have doubts and questions, you're in good company. Wrestle through them. Don't avoid them. And I don't know about you, but I grew up in a church that you could not wrestle through things. You could not doubt. I remember reading Ecclesiastes thinking I was somehow breaking the rules. It was somehow scandalous because I was questioning things. Because I had this idea that this is what life should be like. We'll talk about that with Job. But here's my reality. And if I'm doing the right thing, shouldn't I get rewarded? And my life was not a reward. Other than I could do whatever I wanted to do in my elementary, middle school years and somehow survived it, right? So there's that one. But I remember realizing, oh, there's a massive gap here of what I thought was going to happen with the reality of life. And wrestling through that as an early Christian, kind of messed with me for a while. The teacher's honest about these major issues, and he just wrestles through them. Here's how he starts off. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2 says this, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. This is the summary statement of the book of Ecclesiastes. We could end here, say amen, and go home, and the church would be done. We're not going to, right? Because here's the deal. There's some issues that go on here. If some of you are reading this, you may be reading an NIV, it says meaningless. Some of you have NASB, and it's going to say vain. If you have the CSB, it's going to say futile. And here's the reality. Not that we're getting it wrong, they're just not getting it all right. The Hebrew language is an overstuffed suitcase where one word has so many different meanings. So we're going to read really quickly what the Hebrew word actually means here. It's actually Hevel, H-E-V-E-L, and it's this idea that there's several different ways to translate it. Some of it is that it's a vapor, it's a mist, it's smoke. Some of it is absurd. Sometimes it's going to be used as just a paradox. So the question is, how do you actually know what's the actual meaning of the translation? And this is where context matters. You have to bring in, okay, so what's he actually saying here? What's he actually doing here? Psalm 144 says this, that he's crying out to God, God, what is it about humans that you care about us? We're literally a breath to you. We are a vapor and we're gone. We're a fleeting shadow. And somehow you care about us. That word, that breath here is hevel. We are a mist to you. We've all seen the teapot get hot, mist is out there, but it doesn't stay there, right? It evaporates back out. And this is what he's saying humans are to God. this fleeting shadow. Isaiah 57 uses the word hevel, and he talks about how the idols are hevel. The idols have the appearance of something of substance, but there's nothing they can do. This is the idea of like what we buy into, like Ecclesiastes is saying this, right? And so the other way of translating this is absurdity or a paradox. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 6, he says this: some people, they work so hard, they get so much wealth, they have no clue what to do with everything that they have. Yeah. But the absurdity, the hevel part of this, is that they die and other people get to like have fun with what they bought or what they inherited, what they got. Ever notice this? Like a wise person who's older or whatever leaves an inheritance for the kids, and the kids just waste it away. He's like, that's absurd. That's a hevel. That's the way that you would translate this. And it's not that any of these translations are getting it wrong. They're not just getting it all right. Right? Now we have hyperlinks, so we could explain all this if we actually want to put it on a digital copy, which some of our like Bible apps do this. But imagine if you had to like list out every single time you wanted to use this one word. Here's the 7 ways you can translate this, right? It would probably make it a little bit challenging to read. Maybe, but you never know. The other way of saying this is this, understanding Ecclesiastes chapter 8 says this: there's something else that is meaningless on this earth. The righteous get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked get what the righteous deserve. Anyone ever seen this? And this is where it talks about like the idea and the motives behind why we do what we do. Are we doing what we do just so we get a blessing? Are we doing what we do because it's the right thing to do? And this is where integrity and character and how God doesn't want to just transform our behavior, but our actual desires, our motives. But he says that this is hevel. This is an absurdity. Like, are you kidding me, God? And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're like, yep, been there, seen that. You know what I mean? But the reality behind Ecclesiastes is that he's just simply saying it's all hevel. It's all vapor. It's a mist. It's absurd. And the teacher never claims to have all the answers. The teacher just simply says, there's some things we got to talk about, God. Like, can we actually have this conversation? And God never avoids it. He's like, yeah, let's have this conversation. This was actually, this kind of a literature was typical in the ancient Near East during that time of King Solomon, that they would hire, like the kings would hire someone to write this kind of a word and say, let's just have these conversations. What do we see in our kingdom that doesn't make any sense? And so, this brings us to Job. And in Job, this is where we're going to see some weird things just come out. And I'm just going to be honest with you. We don't have time to dive. Like, we could take 5 years and not really understand the theology behind Job. Job is a loaded book. But if you want to buy me a cup of coffee, I'll sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about it with you, okay? So, all right? So, in Job, here's what we're going to see. Job is a non-Israelite. We need to keep that in mind. And nobody knows where Uz is. There's speculations, there's ideas, there's thoughts, but there's no one left a placard. Does that make sense? And like, here is Job's Uz, whatever. You know what I mean? The way it starts off in the Hebrew is almost like saying, in a galaxy far, far away, and a long time ago. That's kind of the way it reads, right? So here's how it starts off. Job chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. He was blameless and upright, and he feared God, and he shunned evil. The beginning of wisdom, the beginning of walking with wisdom, is to fear God and to shun evil. We see this in Proverbs. We see this in Ecclesiastes. We'll see this in Job. And there's elements of it. You see it in Songs of Solomon. Here's the problem. Most of us want to get the blessings from God while still embracing evil. Because that habit, that substance, that website, that behavior, I'm just angry, this is just who I am, we constantly go back and forth. We want the blessing and the wisdom of God, but we really like this habit. We talked about this before, that we have new hearts with old habits. And sometimes we got to figure out how to break the old habits. Does that make sense? That's the baseline. That's the starting point of learning how to walk in wisdom. And this is what Job does. So you would think with that kind of a statement, he's going to be blessed, he's going to be awesome, it's all this, which he is at the beginning, right? And then verse 6 happens. And this is where it's like, I have no clue how to like wrap this up in a sermon illustration, so I'm not even going to try. But here's what it says. The angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan was with them. In the Hebrew, it actually says the sons of God. They showed up because God has said, hey, let's take attendance. Let's have roll call. And Satan showed up. Now in the Hebrew, it's actually the Satan. Satan. The Satan is not his name. The Satan is the title. That's key. All right? So here is God, and he's in his divine council. He has like a war room, decision room. He's never been in isolation. There's something about God that is beautiful. He's been in the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and now he has this divine council that when major decisions have to be made, for some reason he has a council meeting, and thus Satan shows up. And why is that? Because thus Satan is a created being. Some of us think that Satan and God are equals, and they're just duking it out over this neutral territory we call Earth. And that is false. That's heresy. Whatever book that told you, burn it. Do whatever with it, I don't care. But don't read it and take it as literal. So, God created everything. He is the Elohim. He is the Lord of Lords. And below him are all these divine council meetings, these things and beings, whatever you want to call them, but they all report to him. And so when God says, hey, it's time for roll call, even Satan has to show up and say, I'm here, right? I can't just ignore you, God. I have to show up and say, I'm here and this is what I've been doing. We don't have time to unpack why Satan's on this earth and all that, but he's not in God's presence. This is the closest place that will be in God's presence. So, in this, here's what he says. Hey, God, have you considered, the fact that Job only worships you because you bless him all the time? And this is where it gets weird. And God's like, okay. He's like, what if you just let him go through some suffering? Let's see if he really worships you then. So there's a round one of suffering where Job literally loses everything that he held dear. His family, his house, his flocks, ripped out like that. But God is amazing because Job still worships God. In Job chapter 1, he says this, the Lord gave and the Lord can take away. May the name of the Lord be praised. And all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. And then there's a second round. And now it's on his actual physical body. And here's how he responds. His wife came to him and said, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. Doesn't that make more sense? Whatever's actually going on. You've lost everything. And now it's even on your body. God, you've done something to screw this up. Right? Curse God and die and be done with it. But Job's like, no way. What are you talking about, you foolish woman? Which, by the way, that's probably not a great way to respond to your wife, but circumstances, right? He says this, shall we take only the good from God and not trouble? In all of this, Job did not sin. Now, there's a triangle of tension that's going on here. There's all the characters, there's the wife, there's friends of Job's, there's Job himself, even thus Satan will come out, and they all have this idea that two of these things can be right, but not all three of these things can be right. Raj, I'm going to put that image up. So here's the deal. All of them believe that God is a just God. No one's questioning that yet. All right? And then there's the reality that is Job innocent? And then the third one is karma, or recompense, or whatever you want to call it, where if you do good, you get good. Good things happen to you. If you do bad, then you're going to get bad things happening to you. That was their mindset, that thought that this is how you live your life, this is the ideology, this is the theology of life, this is why theology matters. Because if you approach certain things and you're like, well, this is how I view God and everything about this, it can shape how you endure some of these things. And it can actually add or take away your wisdom. His friends and his wife believe that God is just, but they also believe that karma, recompense, whatever you want to call it, is the way that God rules this universe. Which leaves Job has to be guilty of something. You see this in the theology of the disciples. When they walk up to the blind man and said, who sinned here? The parents or him? He can't be blind for no reason. Right? We run like this. We see things happening to our friends and our family members, and like, must have screwed up somehow. God's getting, you know what I mean? Like, they're finally getting caught. You know what I mean? Like, that's it. And that's how his friends worked. That's how his wife worked. Job, however, does not work like this. Job is like a floating target. Job knows he's innocent. Job is not wavering on this. He believed that God is a just God. But he's like, wait a minute, I thought you ran the universe on karma, or whatever you want to call it, recompense. You do good, you get good, all that. And as the events happen and take away, like the storyline goes, he starts to question, is God really a just God? He has a friend named Elihu who shows up. Elihu shows up and he's long-winded. Like, he makes Tolkien look like he's like bullet points. But he's like several chapters to get to the point. Like, I had to read it several times to figure out what he was saying. Yeah. But in this, he starts questioning. He's like, God is a just God. Maybe Job is innocent. But maybe God doesn't rule on recompense or karma. And this is the first time you see this, that maybe this isn't how the universe is actually ran. And then God shows up and speaks in chapter 38. And what we find out is that God does not run the universe on karma, which is a very good thing. Because your deeds and your horrible thoughts, my deeds and my horrible thoughts, there's no way that the good deeds would ever outweigh the bad deeds. Same thing for you. And if you had to be honest with yourselves, you'd know it too. God does not run on karma, he runs this universe on grace and love. He expects holiness, but he's even willing to say, okay, if you're going to screw this up, I'll take the punishment. And that's what I'm here for. And that's what he does, right? And if we can accept that, that's the amazing gift of this. If we reject it, that's when we start questioning everything that happens to us. And when bad things happen to us, God must hate us. No, it's not. What we find out is that's not how it works. And then when God shows up, because Job has started to question God's justice or righteousness, God takes him on a virtual tour of the universe. And we just get like a glimpse. And he says this, who stepped into my chambers and started talking these words without knowledge? And I'm sure he says this, like, I'm going to ask you things and you're going to answer me like a man. And I'm 900% certain that Job soiled his tunic when he said that. Are you kidding me, God? And then here's what he says. Were you there when I laid the foundations? Were you there when I drew the boundaries and the borders between the waters and the land? Were you there when I held back the waters out of these vaults? Were you there when I told the lights, this is how the light actually is going to work? Were you there when I laid the foundations and said, here's how the earth is going to function? Were you there when I laid the laws of the heavens out? Were you there when I did any of this? Have the lightning bolts ever struck on this earth and reported back to you? Were you there when I looked into the father of dew and the father of rain and the mother womb of ice? You weren't there, Job. Keep answering though, because I'm here. Right? Like, then he keeps going. He's just like, listen, Job's probably like, what in the actual world's going on here, right? And he's like, were you there when you stepped into the hailstorms, the warehouses for hail and snow and light itself? Do you know where the abode of light is, Job? And he's like, I have no clue, right? And he doesn't stop there. Job keeps listening as God says, okay, that's the vastness of God. But then God shows up, and this is the transcendence. This is what theologians call the transcendence. That God holds this universe in the palm of his hands, but he's so intimately aware of what else is going on. And what he asks him is this: do you know when the goat gives birth? Do you know how the mother, like mountain ox, is taking care of her young? What about the bear? How's the bear getting ready for hibernation? Well, do you know anything about like what's actually happening in the wild herds and all this? Do the hawks fly by your wisdom, Job? In other words, he cares about every little detail, not just of your life, but everything around us. And this is the mystery of Job, and this is what actually is happening here. That the vastness and this massive things about Job, but also these intimate details. And this is all in 1 second. And somehow Job is realizing, I'm not the center of this universe. Part of wisdom is realizing you and I are not the center of this universe. And if God wanted to rule the universe based on what you thought, he probably would have asked you. but he didn't. Part of wisdom is understanding, okay, I have no clue. I have no clue what's going on in 1 second. I think I do, but I don't. Parents, we know this. As you're driving, kids are just like, hey, can't you just do this? And you're like, no, I have like 700 steps to process before I make that one decision. Now multiply that by 10 million. And maybe you get an understanding of what God is actually doing in this universe. This is part of that process. And Job comes back to this and he starts, like, he rejects his words, like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube of toothpaste. It's not going to happen, but it's trying. He rejects his words, he repents, he's like, I'm so sorry, and then God shows up again. But he's not angry at Job. He's actually angry at his friends, other than Elihu and his wife. And he says, you can talk to Job and I'll listen to Job's prayers, but I'm not hearing your prayers. Wait a minute. They're not the ones who called you unjust. Job is. Here's the deal about the tension moments for me. Is what I see in God's reality is that when you and I have questions, go directly to God. When we have doubts and wrestle through and all this, just go ask God himself. And those of you who think you know the answers, just shut your mouth. You probably don't. When somebody's going through a painful life issue of like you literally lost everything that you had of dear, you don't know the answer why. So shut up. In the name of Jesus and a loving God, right? If you want to sit there and listen to the person voice whatever is on their heart, awesome. But don't act like you know everything. Because God will not hear your prayers. If you act like you know everything in your arrogance and all that, like, just be quiet, listen. And part of this process of learning how to mature through all these things is just simply learning how to just sit there. What the Hebrew people call sit Shiva. You're going to sit there and you're just going to process with. You don't know everything, so don't act like you do. So here, let's put a bow on this, okay? Parents, if you're in the diaper stage, it's just a phase. The wisdom that we learn from Ecclesiastes is just a vapor. It's going to be here for a moment, then it's going to be gone. If you're in the elementary stage, it's going to be here for a moment, then it's gone. There's wisdom in knowing it's just a phase. It's just a phase, so don't miss it. Don't expect your children to be 10 years ahead of the game. Does that make sense? If they're 4, let them be 4-year-olds. If they're 20, expect them to be 20-year-olds. Right? Push them accordingly, and at some point, they have to make that decision of what they're going to do. And it's just a phase. And when life happens to you and you have no clue what to do, voice your opinions with others, ask for prayer, but then you better go straight to God. Yeah. And don't hold back. Job does not hold back. And God accepts it. Job, the point of Job is not a game plan of how to get a double blessing. Nobody wants to go through what he went through to get that double blessing, but it's like, I think the point of Job is to say, okay, when life happens to me, it's not because I've done something bad or whatever. It's not a karma handbook. I can just go straight to God. Let's pray. God, thanks for this day. Thanks for who you are and everything you've done for us. God, I pray you just watch over us and guide us. And God, would you help us to have wisdom? When the events of life happen to us, how can we actually respond correctly? When Paul says, walk wisely, he's writing that in prison. Following Jesus has not been the greatest thing for his career. And yet he can say, walk wisely. Because he trusts you. God, would you allow us, would you help us to trust you in ways that we can't even understand at this moment? Because you're a just God. And you rule this universe based on grace and your love. We love you, Jesus. So you pray this. Amen.